Lonely rancher found a bride in chains, then realized why she was there. Before we begin, take a moment to drop your city in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? And when the tale is done, don't forget to rate it anywhere between 0 and 10. Now, enjoy the story. The night wind swept hard across the western plains of 1880, hissing sharp as a blade across the sky. Somewhere far off, the mournful cry of a harmonica drifted out from a distant saloon, dissolving into the endless dark. Hooves struck the hard pan in a dry, relentless rhythm, kicking up thin red dust beneath a moon half hidden by heavy clouds. Jonah McGraw, a lone rancher with silence, as his only companion tightened the reins, eyes narrowed against the wind. His old horse Maverick stomped, suddenly letting out a piercing whinny, as if warning of something unseen. And there, at the end of the trail, a wagon stood abandoned in the hush of night. From within its shadows came the clatter of iron chains, hollow cold, echoing like a call from the darkness itself. The man and his buried memories night draped its silence over the western plains, laying shadows across brittle grass and weary land. Fence posts leaned like tired sentinels, cabin walls weathered to silver gray, the hearth cold long since. Out on the open range, the wind moaned and carried red dust rolling toward a dim horizon. Inside the old wooden house, a lantern's faint flame cast trembling light across Jonah McGraw's face. Once a hardened gunslinger, now a man past 40, he was only a rancher left to wrestle with memory. By day, he turned the stubborn earth. By night, he drowned himself in whiskey, yet the burn never filled the hollow carved out when a blood-soaked robbery had taken his wife and child. Outside, the steady clop of Maverick's hooves echoed like the last pulse of life tethering him to the world. That old horse, faithful and worn, stood as a shadow of the past, waiting with patience, though its master no longer waited for anything at all. No visitors came, no hand knocked on his door, only the wind through the grass, the creak of aging wood, and a man locked inside the prison of his memories. And sometimes when the night grew too still, Jonah would whisper to no one but himself, "How long before this silence kills me? If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do?" Part 1. Chains in the Night. The western night of 1880 carried with it a hollow emptiness that could chill a man to the bone. Dry grass bent low beneath the wind-red dust curling from a trail that stretched into forever. Somewhere in the distance, a lone gunshot cracked the silence, maybe from a drunken brawl in a saloon, maybe a bounty hunter ending an outlaw's run. Then, as quickly as it came, the sound was swallowed by silence, leaving only the mournful howl of the wind. Jonah McGraw tugged his leather coat tighter around his shoulders, sitting tall on Maverick, the old horse that had carried him through more roads than he could count. Strands of gray hair slipped across his weathered brow, his thick beard shadowing a face carved by years of hard living. Once he'd been a gunslinger known across the territory. Now he was just a rancher alone, wandering between memory and wasteland. Dust clung heavy to his boots. Broken fence posts leaned like scattered bones along the roadside. Above, the moon was half hidden behind a curtain of clouds, bleeding a pale, sickly glow over the endless trail. Jonah drew a deep breath. The wind carried the scent of rusted iron and horse sweat. Years of solitude had sharpened his ear for the smallest sound. So when Maverick suddenly froze, stomping the earth, ears pricked, Jonah knew something wasn't right. His brows knitted. His hand lowered slowly to the grip of his revolver. Maverick's breath came hot and fast, steaming white against the night. Then it came an odd sound carried on the wind, faint metallic. At first, Jonah thought it might be a stray bell, but listening closer, the rhythm was wrong. It was jagged, brittle, the desperate rattle of iron in the dark. Maverick shuddered. Jonah tightened the reins, leaning forward to peer into the gloom ahead. There, at the end of the road, a dark shape loomed still and heavy, sprawled across the trail. He dismounted, boots crunching the hardpan like brittle twigs. Raising his lantern, he stepped closer. Through the dust, the outline emerged a wagon, old and broken. One wheel canted at a sharp angle, the canvas torn wood splintered and dry. A whip lay snapped in the dirt. The reins were tangled, but there was no horse nearby. No tracks, no fresh marks of travel. The wagon lay abandoned, lifeless like a carcass, left to rot on the open road. Jonah approached slowly. The lantern's glow wavered, throwing his shadow long across the ground. He laid his hand against the door. The wood was cold, trembling faintly from something inside. And then he heard it clearly, the sound of chains. Not wind, not imagination. Chains. Heavy iron grating against itself, sharp yet weak. Jonah's chest tightened. Memory slammed into him, his wife's screams the night of the robbery, his son's cries before being dragged away. And then the silence that never ended. His hand shook around the lantern handle. Maverick whinnied softly outside, urging him on. The wind whistled through the torn canvas, the wagon door creaked in its frame. Jonah swallowed hard, his hand pausing at the latch. He drew a long breath, then yanked. The door swung wide with a groan. Lantern light poured inside, and there, huddled in the shadows, was a figure bound in iron wrists and ankles shackled tight. The lantern flame flickered, throwing trembling shadows across the wagon's hollow interior. Jonah froze. In the far corner, a woman sat, hunched, her wrists bound tight in iron, her ankles raw and bruised from shackles. What had once been a wedding dress now hung in filthy tatters streaked with dust and dried blood. She did not scream. She did not beg. She only lifted her tear-brimmed eyes to his, a look both trembling and broken, like a door left ajar in the middle of a storm. Jonah lowered himself, lantern tilting its glow, spilling across her face. She was young, worn, her cheeks gaunt with exhaustion, yet some line of quiet defiance still lived there. On her neck, dark bruises marked where a collar of iron had once pressed. He reached for the chains. They were ice-cold, heavy as a death sentence. The squeal of metal against metal cut through the silence and stabbed at his chest. His hand stalled, trembling in midair. Memory surged, his wife and child bound and dragged into a night lit by fire, screams ripping the air. Then the silence that followed him ever since. A bead of cold sweat slid down his temple. The woman's lips moved. No sound, only a voiceless plea trapped in her silence. But her eyes, those eyes nailed him where he stood. Outside, Maverick stomped and whinnied, restless, his hooves pounding the ground like a drumbeat urging Jonah on. The rancher's hand slid to the knife at his side. He looked from the woman's shackles to the darkness beyond, and in that instant, he knew this was no accident. This was a crossroads, a reckoning the West itself had thrust into his path. She stirred. The chains rattled, ringing sharp as a verdict. Wind tore through the torn canvas, shaking the lantern's light so it danced over her bruised and battered face. Her voice scraped the air, ragged, broken. Please. The word fell apart, but it was enough. Enough to shake the wall Jonah had built around his heart. He drew the knife. Its blade flashed beneath the lantern light, the sound of steel filling the cramped wagon with a cold promise. But he did not cut. Not yet. Eyes shut tight, he stood on the edge of a choice. To drop the blade would be to step onto a road with no return. The West held its breath. Dust swirled. Timbers groaned, the wind howled through the bones of the land. Inside that broken wagon, Jonah stood motionless, knife in hand, the woman shivering in her bonds, her breath rattling against iron. The scent of rust, of sweat, of long miles of dust filled his lungs. The memory of fire and blood clawed at him, but then her eyes pulled him back, tearful, shaking, yet burning with the faintest ember of hope. No grand speeches, no cries for mercy. Just a look that seemed to ask, will you leave me? The way the world once left your family. Jonah's chest tightened. The blade gleamed, showing him his own reflection, an old broken man adrift in the West. A faint whimper slipped from her lips, so fragile it nearly vanished in the wind, yet enough to shake him to his core. Maverick cried out again, his call carrying through the dark like a command. Jonah closed his eyes. On one side, silence, the familiar weight of loss. On the other, danger, uncertainty, and the chance to save a life. His eyes opened. In them, the lantern flame caught a hard resolve. The knife in his grip no longer trembled. The chains rattled once more, as if they too sensed that truth was about to change. If you were Jonah, standing before a stranger in chains on a forgotten road, would you cut the shackles or turn away? Tell me in the comments. Part 2. The Bride in the Dark. The lantern shook faintly in Jonah's grip, its frail glow spilling into the cramped wagon. Dust clung to every fabric fold, the air heavy with the stench of rot and rusted iron. In the far corner, Maria curled into herself like a crushed leaf, hair matted with sweat and tears. The wedding dress, once white as morning, was now nothing but rags stained with dirt streaked with dried blood. Its hem was torn and frayed, streaked red with the long miles of road. Shackles bound her wrists, her ankles cinched in cruel iron. Every movement ground metal into flesh, leaving raw, bleeding welts. Jonah lowered the lantern and dropped into a crouch. The light flared sideways, catching Maria's eyes. They weren't just eyes of despair, they carried something deeper, a fear worn thin, hardened into silence, after too many days of being treated like a thing to be bought and sold. Jonah had seen brutality in the West before, cattle scattering wild, before a dust storm, travelers collapsing under a merciless sun, outlaws swinging from the limb of an old oak. But nothing had ever clutched at his chest the way this moment did. Maria's lips trembled, but no sound came. Her narrow shoulders shook. The lantern wavered and her shadow stretched, long, distorted, like a soul bound in chains. Jonah's throat closed tight. Outside, the wind moaned through the prairie, and he heard his own breathing, heavy, ragged, as if he'd just stepped from a gunfight. Far off hoofbeats echoed against the night, then faded to nothing. A gust tore through the torn canvas, sending dust spiraling inside. Maria squeezed her eyes shut, coughing hard, tears streaking down her pale cheeks. Jonah gripped the knife handle harder. He knew this land too well, a place where men bartered with gunpowder and women were traded like property. A wedding forced, a bride's wagon no different from a prison cart. And in town, no one would call it wrong. He exhaled, the weight of futility pressing into his bones. Yet Maria's eyes held him fast. They did not merely plead, they burned with a fury, strangled silent, a cry for justice, stifled but not extinguished. The truth of it seared him, injustice raw and living, shackled right before him. The wind shrieked outside. A branch snapped loose and slammed against the wagon roof, sharp and violent. Maria flinched, curling smaller, the chains clattering in protest. Jonah shuddered at the sound. Each metallic clink pierced his memory like a blade, dragging him back to that night his family bound, held captive before they were slaughtered. His jaw tightened. The knife in his hand trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of rising anger, an anger long buried now, clawing its way back into the light. Inside the narrow wagon, the lantern throbbed like a faltering heartbeat. Maria tried to push herself up, only to be yanked sideways by the chains at her wrists. Iron scraped the boards with a sharp cry, echoing outward like a desperate signal in the night. Jonah moved to steady her, then froze halfway. Bruises ringed her wrists like roots twisted tight. The torn veil clung to her shoulder, its last shred of lace catching the light in a ghostly shimmer. Water. She rasped, her voice brittle as wind through dry branches. Jonah unhooked the canteen from Maverick's saddle and poured carefully. She drank, coughing, her eyes never leaving his eyes, carrying that fragile trust. One soul grants another only once in a lifetime. Wind slammed against the canvas, making it scream. Somewhere in the distance, a gunshot cracked, then silence. From the valley below, a herd stampeded, hooves thunderous as hail on tin. Dust rose, swirling into the wagon, painting her face in a red haze. Jonah bent closer. Beneath the shredded dress, he noticed a corner of cloth, a handkerchief embroidered with a single letter, M, the blue thread frayed by time. He tugged it free, and beneath it a scrap of paper tucked against her bodice. "If you find this, do not take me back to Cedar. I am not a possession." The writing shook, ink blurred, but its truth cut sharp as a blade. "Your name, Jonah?" asked, voice low, steady. "Maria," she whispered. "They'll come back. He paid." That word paid dropped heavy, vanishing into the abyss between them. Jonah stared at the chains, at the trembling note, then back into her eyes both fierce and broken. He'd long been a man dismissed, spoken of in saloons as a ghost who'd turned his back on people. Yet here in this wagon, rumor meant nothing. What mattered was real, a woman sold, shrinking herself small just to survive. "I will." Jonah swallowed, hand falling to the bone-handled knife at his belt. Outside, Maverick cried, hooves pounding as if warning that the night was far from empty. The wind shifted, rattling loose boards like bones. The west itself seemed to hold its breath. Jonah lifted the knife, the blade catching cold light. Maria flinched, then steadied, not because she trusted steel, but because she saw in this weary man the struggle of choosing a path with no way back. "They'll say you belong to them," Jonah's voice rasped, "but you don't belong to anyone." Maria gave the faintest nod, nearly lost in the shadows, yet enough to break the ice Jonah had carried around his heart for years. He set the blade to the chain. At that range, he heard his own breath mingling with the smell of rust, sweat, and dust. Steel screeched against iron, sparks flashing before the wind stole them away. "Slow! Someone's patrolling." Maria gasped, her eyes darting toward the fields. Jonah snuffed the lantern in an instant. Darkness sealed them in. He listened. Yes, there it was. Hooves. Slow. Testing. The kind of rhythm bounty men rode across the night. A coarse laugh, the spit of tobacco, then fading. Not Cedar's men, but enough to remind him the night belonged to wolves. He relit the lantern, whispering, "We can't wait till morning." "No." Maria said every word brittle as broken glass. "The buyer is the deputy's friend. By dawn, the papers will be signed." Jonah gave a bitter chuckle. Papers. The West was good at writing them, ink that turned flesh into property, silence into seal. He slipped his scarf beneath her wrists so the knife wouldn't cut her skin. "Don't move." With each pry, the links shifted. A rivet snapped loose with a sharp crack. Maria gasped, tears spilling. Jonah froze, listening as the wind veered, carrying dry thunder over the horizon. Cattle roared, hooves rolling like war drums. "Why the chains?" Jonah asked, not daring to meet her eyes. Silence, then soft as embers, still warm under sand. "Because I said no." The knife slipped, a link clattered to the floor. Jonah caught it before it rolled. Maria stared at that fragment of freedom no larger than a thumb, as though it were the first wildflower breaking through stone. "I don't need a husband," she whispered, her voice steadier now. "I only want to live as a human being." The words struck Jonah like summer rain dousing a field of dry grass. He clenched his jaw, yanked hard. Another link broke. Not all the lock still bound her, but her wrists were loose enough to move. He wrapped the embroidered M cloth around her raw skin, tying it into a bandage soft as breath. "Stand," Jonah said, voice firm, no longer trembling. Maria staggered upright, the ankle chains still dragging, but their bite less cruel. She braced against the wagon wall, her eyes scanning the world, with a spark not entirely drowned. For the first time, Jonah saw in her the same strength he had once seen in his wife, the way a woman could shrink herself to pass through fire, yet hold on to her soul. Outside, the prairie stirred, hooves fading, the wind circling low. Dust hung in the moonlight like a veil. All of the West seemed to lean toward the wagon door, waiting to see what choice this man would make with the rest of his life. Jonah sheathed the knife hand resting on the latch. "Come. They'll hate you for this," Maria whispered. "I've lived long enough with hate," Jonah answered. He helped her down from the wagon. Maverick's stomped ears pitched forward as if already choosing his side. The wind rose, spinning dust around them, three-man woman horse like an unseen rope binding their fates together. Jonah lifted Maria onto the saddle, setting her sideways across the worn leather. His hand steadied her waist, saying nothing with words. "Only one truth, I see you. And I am here." "Your name?" she asked. "Jonah. And me. If someday I vanish from this place, then before that day," he cut in gently, "you'll have known freedom." A shadow flickered on the ridge. Jonah turned sharp. Along the cedar trail, the faint ember of a cigar glowed, blinked, then died. Strangers in the night or hunters from town. It didn't matter. Tonight every eye in the dark carried the weight of danger. "Hold tight," Jonah said. "We're not going to Cedar." Maverick turned, lunging into the dust, tearing the road behind them into smoke. The saddle creaked, the hooves rang their rhythm, a wordless song for those who chose a different path. And from the far-off saloon, the harmonica's lonely tune drifted once more, a ballad of wanderers and those left behind, of broken chains and the scars they leave upon the flesh. Jonah never looked back. He knew the West would speak of him, twist his name into a tale. but no tale could ever bury the moment a man put his blade to iron and whispered enough. Maverick thundered across the cracked earth, red dust rising like a haze of blood in the night. Maria clung tight to the saddle, the shackles at her ankles still clattering, but the sound was different now. It no longer spoke of captivity. It rang like chains, panicking, terrified of losing their hold. The wind whipped across their faces, carrying with it the last breath of the day's heat. In the distance, the town of Cedar glowed under its lanterns. Wooden roofs crouched at the foot of the hills. Jonah didn't look back. He knew Cedar was no place for justice. It belonged to the man with the most money and the most guns. Maria turned her head, her tangled hair streaming wild in the wind. Tears streaked her face, but they were no longer born of despair. In the moonlight, they gleamed like a kind of cleansing. "Are you not afraid?" she asked softly, her voice carried away in the rhythm of hooves. Jonah did not answer at once. Each rise and fall of the saddle pressed down on his chest the weight of a choice that would outlive him. At last he said only, "If I'd been afraid, I would have left you in the dark." From the valley below, a herd of cattle burst across their path, dust boiling upward, bellows drowning even the wind. Maverick spun, arrowing through the chaos, his hooves skimming the storm. Jonah held the reins steady, guiding horse and rider both. Maria clutched him, her hands trembling, but she did not let go. They broke free of the herd. The hill ahead opened wide like a door to another world, one without fences, without jeering voices, only grassland rolling out beneath an endless sky. Jonah reined Maverick in, letting the old horse breathe. He looked at Maria, the embroidered handkerchief with its single M fluttering at her wrist. Tonight it was no longer the mark of something bought and sold, it was a small banner of defiance. Maria met his eyes, lips quivering. "Am I truly free?" Now Jonah said nothing. Promises were not his way, but the look he gave her, clear and unwavering in the night, answered for him. Freedom begins here. On the horizon, dry lightning split the sky again, throwing their shadows, 2 souls and 1 horse, onto the silver-gray canvas of the heavens, alone yet carrying a strength greater than any crowd back in Cedar. Jonah drew a long breath and let his hand fall away from the gun. He knew the road ahead was danger, but he also knew this from this moment on he would not walk it alone. If you were riding that horse with Maria, hearing the chains still clink in the wind, would you stop to break them now or keep riding into the night? Share your thoughts below. Part 3. The Eyes That Pleaded. The western plains stretched out without end, the wind rushing as if it meant to sweep through the very soul. Maverick slowed after the long ride, his hooves crunching through brittle grass. Somewhere in the distance, a lone prairie dog howled, its cry spreading wide and thin like oil on still water. Jonah held the reins firm, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was no stranger to the emptiness of the range, yet tonight, that emptiness carried weight, an invisible threat lingering just beyond reach. Now and then the wind lashed harder, stinging his eyes with sand. Maria rode behind him, her hands still trembling. The shackles at her ankles dragged with every step, the metal clinking sharp in the night. The sound crawled under Jonah's skin, a constant reminder that her past still clung to her like iron ghosts. They stopped at a low rise. Jonah set the lantern on a stone, its weak circle of light spilling out small and fragile. Beyond that ring of glow, the prairie drowned in thick darkness. Maria sank down against the earth, arms wrapped around her knees, her wide eyes fixed on Jonah. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In her gaze was 1,000 words, all swallowed back. He read them anyway: terror, hunger for protection, and the silent question, "Can I trust you?" Jonah's breath caught. His hand twitched, wanting to draw his coat around her shoulders, but he froze midway. These hands had once cradled a wife and child and then lost them forever. What if his touch now brought nothing but ruin again? That hesitation was shattered as the wind howled into a sudden storm. A wall of sand swept across the field, the lantern shuddering its flame, dancing wild like ghost fire. Maverick screamed, turning his head against the blast dust rising in choking clouds. Jonah lunged forward, wrapping Maria to his chest, shielding her as grit cut like knives across their faces. The storm roared like a pack of starving wolves, drowning out all sound. Maria lifted her head, eyes shining through the chaos, catching the flare of dry lightning that split the sky. She said nothing. She only looked at him long, desperate, unyielding. A gaze so raw it broke him open. It was more than a plea for life. It begged, "Don't leave me. Don't let me be abandoned again the way they did." The chains clattered against stone, their harsh clang striking louder than the storm itself. Jonah gritted his teeth, clutching her tighter, vision blurring with dust. And in that moment, memory struck another sandstorm years past the one that had torn his family from him. Their screams had faded into the howl of wind, leaving him with silence. But tonight the storm passed as swiftly as it came. When the dust settled, the pale moon returned. Maria was still in his arms, and her eyes, though dry now, remained etched into him, carved deeper than any wound. Jonah released her, slowly sitting back in silence. He knew then another wall inside him had just fallen away. Part 3. The Eyes That Begged. The western plain stretched endless, the wind sweeping across it as though it might strip a man bare down to his soul. Maverick slowed after miles of travel, his hooves crunching through dry grass. Somewhere far off, a prairie dog gave a long, mournful cry, the sound spilling outward like a stain on silence. Jonah held the reins, steady, his eyes cutting across the horizon. He was no stranger to emptiness, but tonight the emptiness felt heavy, laced with something unseen, something watching. Dust stung his eyes whenever the wind struck hard. Maria rode behind him, her hands trembling still. The shackles at her ankles dragged and clinked with every stride, that hollow sound digging into Jonah's nerves. To him it wasn't just iron, it was a reminder of chains still unbroken, a past not yet shed. They stopped on a low rise. Jonah set the lantern on a stone, its pale glow carving only a fragile circle of light. All else was swallowed in black. Maria folded herself down at the base of the mound, arms wrapped tight around her knees, her gaze locked on Jonah. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Her eyes held words she could not speak. Fear raw as bone, longing to be safe, and the question she could not voice. "Can I trust you?" Jonah's chest tightened. His hand lifted, wanting to lay his coat across her shoulders. But he stopped halfway. These were the hands that had once held wife and child, and then lost them forever. What if his touch cursed again? The thought shattered as the wind rose into a sudden sandstorm. The lantern flickered madly, its flame leaping like wild spirits. Maverick reared, neighing against the blast. Dust swarmed, choking and stinging. Jonah lunged forward, pulling Maria to his chest, shielding her as the storm tore at them. Sand lashed like knives. The wind howled like wolves. Maria lifted her face, eyes wide, lightning flashing across them, turning them into burning glass. No words left her lips, but her stare burned into him, desperate, unyielding. "Don't abandon me. Don't leave me as they did." The chains struck stone, ringing loud, louder than the storm itself. Jonah gritted his teeth, clutching her tighter, vision blurred with grit. And in the chaos, memory cut deep, another storm long ago when screams of wife and child had been swallowed by a roaring gale. Then, as quickly as it had come, the storm passed. Dust thinned. Moonlight returned, cold and silver. Maria still lay within his arms. Her eyes, no longer wet, still shone with the same fire etched into him like a carving in stone. Jonah released her, slowly settling back into silence. He knew the truth then, another wall inside him had fallen. If you were Jonah staring into eyes that begged for freedom beneath the vast western sky, would you risk everything to protect her? Share your thoughts below. Part 4. The whisper night settled heavy, the moon hanging pale and cold above the western sky. Its light poured thin and silver over the plains, laying a ghostly sheen across dry grass and red earth. Jonah made a rough camp beneath the spread of an old oak. The fire burned low embers, glowing like dying eyes, casting his face in shifting shadows. Maria sat near the flames, still bound, her tattered wedding dress streaked with dirt. The shackles at her ankles quivered lightly with the night breeze. From afar came the crack of a single gunshot, then silence. Wild dogs howled their cries, weaving with the wind. Cattle lowed in panic somewhere in the valley, their hooves drumming the ground like war drums. The air drew taut, a string pulled so tight it seemed the faintest breath might snap it. Jonah sat unmoving, his hand brushing the worn handle of his revolver. He was no stranger to this tension. Out here, when darkness fell, justice laid down to sleep. Only the law of the gun kept watch. His eyes flicked toward Maria. She did not weep. She simply lifted her gaze to the moon, letting its faint glow drape over her hollowed face. Something in that look struck Jonah's chest. He had never seen eyes so fragile and yet so proud in the same breath. Maria shifted the chains at her wrists, rasping dry and harsh in the night air. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them again, fixing him with a stare that would not break. Her lips moved, pale and trembling, her voice little more than a breath dragged through stone. "Please, don't let them take me." Just 6 words, but each cut like a blade across flesh. Jonah froze, the fire in his chest flaring wild. He had heard a plea like that before from his wife, bound and screaming on the night bandits came. Maria's gaze clung to him, shaking, desperate, as though her very fate hung upon his reply. Her whisper slipped into the wind like a blood oath, forcing the world itself to pause and listen. Jonah wanted to answer. His heart surged with it, but his throat locked dry as dust. All he could do was clench the revolver grip until his knuckles burned. Memories stormed back, his son's cries, his wife's begging, then the gunshots that ended everything. And in that moment, Jonah understood. Maria was not only asking him to save her life, she was calling him back to the debt of blood he had carried all these years. Part 4. The whisper turned to steel. The wind screamed across the plain's sand, cutting the skin like lashes. The campfire sputtered, then died, leaving only a thick, suffocating dark. Maverick stomped and snorted uneasy as Jonah caught the shift in the night. He tilted his head. Hooves. Distant, steady, deliberate, the cadence of men who hunted, or buyers come back to claim what they'd paid for. A low, guttural laugh carried on the wind, followed by a sharp whistle that sliced the silence open. Maria trembled. She fought to hold herself still, but her eyes sought Jonah's, wide and burning in the dark. She said nothing, but the look struck like an arrow. "Keep your word. Don't let them take me." Jonah rose, slow, his hand settling on the worn handle of his revolver. His breath came heavy, thick as smoke in the wind. He wasn't sure he could take them all, but the memory of loss and the fire in Maria's gaze left no room to back away. The night thickened around them. Hooves pressed closer, dust rolling silver in the weak moonlight. Jonah felt the weight of it in his bones tonight. He stood between darkness and the ghosts of his past. Maria's hand clutched at his sleeve, small and ice-cold, but fierce, and it gave him a strength he thought long dead. She whispered again, this time more urgent, her voice shaking but clear. "I don't need a husband. I just want to live as a human being." The words cut him open like steel across a shackle. He froze, every muscle strung tight. In his ears, echoes from another night, rose his boy's voice crying, "Pa, I don't want to die." His wife's plea, "Jonah, don't let them take me." His jaw clenched. Blood hammered in his temples. Maria wasn't only pleading for herself, she was holding up a mirror to everything he had lost. And if he stayed silent now, he would be burying himself alive once more. The hoofbeats closed in. 3 shadows appeared, etched hard against the moon. Guns glinted at their sides, their eyes glimmering with hunger for power. One called out, "Hand the girl over McGraw." Cedar's gold already bought her. Jonah straightened the moon, casting his gaunt face in silver. One hand rested on the gun, the other held before Maria like a shield. Behind him, her shackled ankles caught the moonlight, and her eyes, wide, unwavering, fastened on him. No words, just that gaze. "Please, don't let them take me." The wind shifted, carrying the acrid scent of scorched grass. Maverick reared, screaming into the night. From afar, cattle thundered in panic, their stampede cloaking the moon in a haze of dust. The chains at Maria's ankles clattered like war drums, urging Jonah to decide. His heart pounded, each beat a hammer strike. The firestorm of memory raged, his wife dragged into the flames, his boy's cries fading into nothing. It tore through him until only resolve remained. He shut his eyes for a breath, then opened them sharp as the edge of a blade. Pulling Maria close, he whispered through his teeth, "No one's taking you. Not while I'm breathing." The revolver cleared leather, its steel voice echoing across the plains like a vow carved in iron. The riders flinched, their bravado cracking in the moonlight. Before them did not stand a broken rancher. Before them stood a man who had chosen once and for all never to let darkness win again. Maria gripped her tattered dress eyes, trembling yet alight. And in that gaze, Jonah found a strength he thought forever lost. In this moment, he wasn't just shielding a woman. He was reclaiming the justice that had been stolen from his life. If you were Jonah standing under the pale moon with 3 guns aimed your way, would you fight for her freedom or step aside? Tell me in the comments. Part 5. The Cold Town. The noon sun poured down like fire, beating the dust-heavy trail into the heart of Cedar. Maverick's breath came hard, his mane-tangled hooves dragging heavy against cracked earth. Jonah rode upright in the saddle, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him, Maria clutched an old cloak tight around her shoulders, her wary gaze fixed on the row of low wooden buildings coming into view. Cedar was small, just a couple of dirt streets, a brick church, a handful of shops, and the saloon on the square where all roads seemed to end. But Jonah knew better than most small towns out west often hid the harshest truths. In places like this, law was measured not by justice, but by who carried the most gold and the heaviest gun. A gunshot cracked in the distance, maybe a land quarrel, maybe a duel no one would survive. Maria flinched, clutching tighter at the cloak. Jonah said nothing. His head dipped, the gesture of a man too used to the sounds of death to startle anymore. They stopped before the Silver Spur. Harmonica notes wavered out through the swinging doors, tangled with raucous laughter, the reek of whiskey sweat and gunpowder. Jonah tied Maverick to the post, then eased Maria down. The shackles at her ankle rattled sharply, drawing glances from men outside. Their eyes lingered, half curiosity, half mockery. Jonah pushed the door open. Hinges groaned, dust hung in the shaft of sunlight behind them. For one breath, the saloon went still, every gaze cutting toward them. Smoke clung thick to the rafters. At a corner table, a ring of cowhands slouched over cards, pistols gleaming at their hips, glasses of whiskey wobbling in their hands. Their stares caught on Maria, her torn wedding dress, the chains dragging, and they barked into laughter. "Hey, McGraw, pick yourself up a bride off the trail," one shouted. Another gave a long whistle, grinning wide. "Looks like Cedar left a package behind." The room erupted, laughter rolling through like thunder. Maria dropped her gaze, her hands clawing at the fabric of her dress. Shame burned her cheeks, fear tightening her shoulders. The shackles clinked against the wood floor, loud as humiliation itself. Jonah set his hand heavy against the bar. The old bartender polished a glass, his eyes flicking toward Maria, then sliding away cold, and practiced as if he'd seen too much of this to care anymore. "I need help, Jonah," said, voice low and graveled. "She isn't property. Someone here in Cedar bought and sold her, and it ends now." The laughter cut for just a heartbeat. Then one of the poker players leaned back, sneering. "Ends," he drawled. "Out here we call that a transaction. You've been living too long in the dust, McGraw. Forgotten how the West plays its hand." The saloon roared again with laughter, louder, crueler. Maria lifted her head, eyes locking on Jonah's. Despair flickered there, but something else too. A question sharp as a blade. "Will you leave me here, swallowed by their laughter?" Jonah's hand curled into a fist, bones popping in the silence between their breaths. And in that moment he saw it clear. Every eye in the room was cold stone, unmoved by pain, blind to humanity. Cedar was a town that had traded its soul away, and now every man in it waited to see whether Jonah McGraw would stand or break. Part 5. The Cold Town. The noon sun had baked the road into Cedar until it cracked dust, rising with every step of Maverick's hooves. By the time Jonah pushed through the swinging doors of the Silver Spur, the heat outside seemed to follow him in, mixing with smoke whiskey and the stench of gun oil. Inside, laughter had already greeted them, sharp, cruel laughter at Maria's torn dress and rattling chains. Jonah had stood at the bar, his voice gravel scraping wood as he said, "She isn't property," and this ends now." But the men only sneered. A fat-bellied rancher banged his mug on the table. "McGraw, the whole town knows the trade. You think you can stop it? Save one and 10 more will come tomorrow. Don't break our law." The poker table howled at the clinking of Maria's chains as if it were music to drink by. Maria shrank back her shoulders, trembling, the sound of iron cutting sharper than any insult. Jonah's temples burned. He saw his wife again, her eyes pleading in firelight. He saw his boy terrified, dragged into the dark. He had buried those memories deep, but now Maria's humiliation tore them open like fresh wounds. He planted both hands on the bar, his voice raw. "No man has the right to chain another. Hear me well." For a heartbeat, silence. Then harsher laughter crashed back, filling every corner of the room. A young gunfighter twirled his revolver steel, flashing in lamplight. "So what then? McGraw gonna shoot the whole damn town?" The air thickened, smoke and silence pressing down. Jonah shut his eyes and the past stormed in his home, burning his wife's screams, his boy's cries cut off by gunfire. Then he opened them, and all he saw was Maria shackled, trembling, but watching him, her eyes begging, "Don't let them take me." He straightened shoulders, square hand closing over the Colt at his hip. The room stilled, every breath loud as a hammer strike. Maria's lips moved, voiceless, but he read it clear. "Please, don't leave me." Jonah stepped forward. His boots hit the floorboards hard, each step a drumbeat. He swept the room with his gaze, then spoke low, steady. "I'm not here to start a war. I'm asking one thing. Who among you can look her in the eye and say she ain't human?" The silence deepened. A few faces faltered, but then a man spat at the floor. "In Cedar, women are stock. Bought, sold, traded, that's all." Maria sagged chains clattering against wood, their sound sharp as a funeral bell. But even through her tears, her eyes clung to Jonah, a small flame refusing to die. Jonah's teeth clenched. The Colt flashed free, its metallic snap ringing through the saloon like thunder. He aimed at the floor and fired. Boom! Wood splintered dust. Rose cattle outside bellowed in panic. The echo rolled out into the street, rattling windows, scattering silence. Jonah's voice followed, cold and carved in iron law. Out here might sleep easy, but tonight it wakes. Anyone who touches her answers to me first. The room hung frozen. Some men dropped their gaze, others eased back, boots scuffing. And through the open door, the lonely cry of a harmonica drifted slow and mournful, as if the town itself knew he'd spoken truth. Maria's eyes filled tears, bright as firelight. No words, only the look that pierced him, deep gratitude, belief, and something he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since the night he lost everything, Jonah knew he was standing where he was meant to stand. If you were in that saloon watching Jonah defy a whole town for one chained bride, would you have stood with him or kept silent? Tell me in the comments. Part 6. The Past Returns. The afternoon wind whipped down Cedar's dusty street, lifting the grit into a thin curtain that stung the eyes. Jonah leaned beneath the overhang of the general store, his gaze fixed on the washed-out sky. Gunpowder still lingered in his nose. The saloon's piano had fallen silent, leaving only the broken notes of a drifter's harmonica tumbling through the market square like a song already half forgotten. Maria stood close behind, wrapped in the ragged cloak, her ankle chains clicking faintly, clink, clink, a sound small yet sharp enough to pry open a chest Jonah had buried deep. With every rattle, the iron seemed less like her prison and more like the key to a trunk of memory he'd fought all his life to keep locked. Cedar receded. The saloon dissolved into a barn. The laughter of cowhands shrank to a thin whistle of winter wind. Jonah's knuckles blanched against the post. He could see Maverick's mane flashing past his eyes, the weathered doorframe of his old cabin, the water barrel by the fence. The years peeled back like film running in reverse. He heard the creak of boards beneath familiar footsteps, smelled scorched cornbread and warm butter. The sound of cloth brushing a line, a bowl set gently on a table, a child's laughter skipping across the yard. Then darkness swooped in sudden as a vulture dropping over calves. Jonah closed his eyes. The door of memory swung open. That day had been bright, so bright the blue ridges on the horizon looked honed from steel. Noon hammered down straight and sharp on the roof beams. His wife pinned white linens along the line wooden clips biting against the fabric. Their boy clattered across the yard on a stick horse mimicking Maverick's hoofbeats clop clop, each step sure proud. Cattle lounged in the shade of the cottonwood, lowing soft in the heat. The air was so calm, Jonah almost believed hardship had passed them by. He hefted a sack of hay to the barn, pausing just to breathe in the sounds of his home cloth whispering dishes, shifting a child's giggles. Then the wind turned. Crows dipped low over the tall grass. A line of dust smeared the horizon. Jonah shaded his eyes. It might have been a wagon train, or it might have been death. Out here, omens wore both faces. He stepped inside, spoke quiet to his wife about fence posts needing mending. Her hand brushed the table edge, fingers dusted with cornmeal, her eyes steady, wordless. In their home silence spoke enough: one nod, one breath, one glance at the child near the hearth. The low rumble came then. Earth itself seemed to sigh. The cattle lurched up in alarm. That dust line thickened, hardening like smoke. First one black speck broke from it, then two, then four. Jonah set cartridges on the table, bolted the barn door. His body moved faster than thought. Corral. The herd shut the gate, call the boy. He whistled, sharp voice cutting across the yard, pushing the cattle back. The beasts bellowed, eyes, white lungs pounding. Gunfire cracked. One shot, then two, rolling from the southern field. The herd exploded, hooves tearing earth. His boy's laughter died to silence. His wife's linens whipped in the hot gust, white cloth snapping like sails torn in a storm. Jonah ripped his Colt from the holster, shoved wife and child through the door. His palm rapped once on the table, a signal etched in memory: hide, lock. Then he turned, running hard across the yard, Maverick's hooves drumming beside him. And there they were, 4 riders, hats pulled low, kerchiefs masking faces, their pistols hanging like snakes ready to strike. Not outlaws worth naming, just the muck that rose after drought, scum that soured every well. One fired skyward, the round punched tin sparrows scattering wild. Cattle screamed and surged, breaking fences. Jonah braced himself at the gate, whip cracking, chest burning muscles, shaking one man, holding back a flood of iron and horn. Then came the click of a hammer at his skull. A voice growled enough. A rough hand forced him down, the Colt pressed to his neck. His wife burst from the cabin. A strip of linen tore loose, flailing like a broken wing. One rider swung a rope. In a snap, it coiled her arm. She cried out, pulled off her feet. Their boy lunged forward, only to be slammed flat into the dust. The world froze. So still, Jonah heard the fence posts groan, heard his heart pound like iron striking iron. Above, a cloud slid over the sun. Below, red dust settled on his wife's hair, his boy's eyes, his own boots. Another outlaw ripped the Colt from Jonah's hand, tossing it to the porch. The metal rang sharp on wood small as a pebble, but in that noon silence, it sounded like judgment. And Jonah knew in that exact heartbeat, his land was no longer home. It was a killing ground. Night fell suddenly like a black tarp thrown over the ranch. The wind turned cold, carrying the smell of damp straw and rusted iron into the lungs. They tied them inside the horse stable, Jonah's wife with her arms yanked behind her back, bound by a rope that reeked of sweat and horses. The child tied with thinner twine, pressed against his mother's leg, his wide eyes fixed on Jonah's back, as if trying to memorize his father's shape one last time. Jonah was forced against the center post, his wrists bruised purple by the ropes. The gang's leader laughed hoarsely, pulled down his mask to spit tobacco, his voice thick as mud. Stop fighting, McGraw. Out here, land doesn't belong to men who stay gentle. The riders left one by one, leaving 2 guards at the door with storm lamps. Their light wavered, throwing snake-like shadows of rope across the wall. Maverick, tied in the stall opposite, snorted, eyes wet and shining. Each time he jerked, the chain rattled against the iron ring, clink, clink, a sound, repeating itself until it became a hammer, beating against Jonah's future. Amid the stench of hay and dung, Jonah heard his wife whisper his name. No one sobbed. In the West, people saved tears, like they saved water in a dry season. She tilted her head to touch her forehead to the boys, whispering something tiny, perhaps a story about the first rain of spring, or how to hold on to Maverick's back so he wouldn't fall. The smallest things suddenly turned sacred when all around was only guns and rope. Outside, a harmonica's tune was torn apart by the wind, like water breaking over dry stone. The cattle stampeded in panic when a warning shot cracked near the fence. The stable door flew open. One outlaw tossed in a torch, its flames crawling slow over the damp hay, so slow that each ember looked like letters spelling out, "Don't let them take her away." Jonah's wife looked straight at him. No words. Only her eyes calm in a strange way, as if she were the one soothing his despair. The rope bit deeper into her wrists, blood seeping dark in the storm lamp's glow. The boy trembled but leaned forward to shield his mother, a small gesture that made Jonah's chest feel like it would burst. He held his breath, twisted his wrists, searching for a gap between rope and skin. His fingertips brushed the rusty edge of an old nail sticking loose in the post. Just a little more. Just one more push. The guard's gaze drifted. The fire climbed higher, smoke creeping along the beams like a cautious beast. "Look at me," Jonah whispered, so his wife's calm could flow into him instead. "I'm here." The rope gave way with a snap. At that same instant, the guard half turned his head. Jonah's wife moved, her lips barely opening them, but her words reached him through smoke and wind. "Please, don't let them take me." The sentence fell into Jonah like a stone dropped into a deep well. No echo, only weight, pulling everything to the bottom. He wrenched harder wrists, screaming. The rope loosened again. But just as he was about to slip one hand free, the door slammed open. A rifle butt crashed across his skull. The world caved into iron blood and black. In that collapsing darkness, only one thing remained. His wife's eyes, two small stars, steady and bright enough that he thought he could build a bridge from his heart straight to them. Then the dark swallowed everything whole. The next morning brought no rain, only wind spreading the stench of ash. A black scar of fire ran across the stable, the clothesline, the half-burned wooden clips. The cabin's frame leaned, crooked smoke stains clawing from the floorboards up to the rafters like handwriting from the night. Jonah woke to Maverick's broken whinny. Blood matted his scalp, his mouth dry as chalk. He staggered to his feet, surrounded by ash and silence. No laughter, no whispers, only a prairie holding its breath, as if every sound had been claimed by those who started it. He stumbled across the warm ash floor, his boots stirring sparks still smoldering. By the stable wall lay his son's wooden horse, split in two, one wheel burned to coal. Jonah knelt, lifted it, rubbed its charred edge until his fingertips blackened. Nearby lay a strip of scorched linen, still carrying the faint scent of cheap soap and yesterday's sun. He folded it, tucked it inside his shirt, like a hidden prayer. Two men with badges came by when the sun was a handspan high. One wore a flat-brimmed hat, his shadow stretching like spilled ink. He glanced over the ruins and smirked. Bad accident. Windy season. Accident. Jonah rasped, voice barely human. The other shrugged. "You're talking to the law. In Cedar, no petition, no witness. We're busy. Folks are waiting on land papers for the south lots." To Jonah, the glint of their badges looked like nails hammered into a headstone. He said nothing more. When they left, their horse's dust laid a new layer over the ash, pushing everything further away. Jonah buried the wooden horse and the strip of linen at the cottonwood tree under damp soil. No marker, only a short vertical cut carved into the bark, with his knife a line that looked like a tear dried by wind. That night he sold his calves cheap to a trader without a word, boarded the windows, barred the gate. Old friends knocked, he didn't answer. Even the harmonica from the saloon couldn't pull him to the porch. From then on, Jonah spoke through silence. They called him cold. He didn't argue. They called him coward. He didn't argue. In the West, a man could live through many seasons of wind simply by burying his voice deeper than a well opening and closing his eyes according to the way dust blew. Years later, the same wind still combed the grass. Only now, each time it passed through the chain hung by the stable, it rattled clink clink like the old dinner bell that once called a family to a table that would never be full again. That clink, not from the past stable but from Maria's shackled ankle, dragged Jonah out of memory, throwing him back to Cedar's sun-bleached street where dust slanted in the afternoon light. Maria stood behind him, shawl tight around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the gray streak of ash brushed across Jonah's collar as if she recognized something unnamed. He turned. In her gaze burned the same stubborn flame that once stood steady in the fire of fragile faith but alive like a wildflower rising through stone. From the saloon, curses spilled as men muttered about the bullet in the floorboard. At the far end of the street, the deputy's flat-brim hat passed the stink of leather and gun oil riding the breeze. Jonah heard their boots scrape wood, the same sound that once crushed his home flat. Across the way, the blacksmith pulled his forge door shut. The fire still glowed inside Hammer resting on the anvil waiting. Jonah looked at the forge, then at the iron around Maria's ankle. The shackle gripped her slim bone like a collar on a bird just freed from a trap. His heart began to pound with the rhythm of the fire inside that forge steady, unshaken. "Come," he said. "We'll break it here, in front of everyone." Maria flinched, then stilled her fear smoothing over like water calmed by wind. Together they stepped into the glare of the alley. With each step, the shackle chimed the last echoes of a sentence about to lose its hold. Jonah rapped 3 times on the smith's frame. The old man looked up, smoke-curled beard like old rope. "Need this broken," Jonah said, pointing at the iron. "Who paid for it?" the smith asked, eyes darting toward the street. "No one can buy a human being," Jonah answered, voice low as the anvil. For a breath, Cedar's noise slowed, the clink of glasses, the scrape of boots, the off-key harmonica. The smith set down his hammer, slid thick leather over the anvil, and nodded. Maria laid her ankle atop it, trembling. Jonah stood opposite, eyes locked on hers. "It'll hurt," he whispered. "I know," she said, voice dry as autumn leaves. "But pain for freedom is better than silence for death." The hammer fell. Sparks burst like steel flowers. The shackle cracked, faint hairline shining. The smith nodded. Jonah pulled his bone-handled knife, wedged it into the split. A sharp snap rang out. The circle of iron fell to the floor, rolled once, and lay still like the last snake killed. Maria did not weep. She only exhaled soft, as if she had just climbed the wall of a prison with no name. Jonah picked up the shackle, set it back on the anvil, and with one final blow flattened it until no one could tell it had ever encircled flesh. They stepped outside. Cedar's street still held its dust, its sideways stares. Yet something had shifted, a glance that hesitated, a bartender clearing his throat, a water-bearer pausing mid-step. The West's silence. The silence that had sheltered crimes tilted ever so slightly. Jonah gave Maria his cloak. She pulled it high to hide her bruised wrists. Neither spoke, but between them a new cord had been tied, not of iron but of resolve. The wind carried dust across the prairie. At the horizon, a flock of crows changed direction, leaving the sky a little lighter. Jonah laid his hand on Maverick's neck. The old horse snorted, pawed, once the beat of a departure. "We don't stay here," Jonah said. "They'll come." Maria nodded. "Where you ride, I ride." They turned north toward hills, rising like the backbone of some giant beast asleep. As Maverick's hooves rose and fell, the dust swallowed old tracks, leaving behind a cedar that had just witnessed something it had long forgotten, a man breaking chains in broad daylight. Near the edge of town, Jonah looked back once. For a moment he saw 2 times overlapped his wife and child in the fire, Maria in the sun. The old chains dragging, the new one snapping. One line had been severed, another just begun. Jonah no longer heard Cedar's crooked harmonica. What reached him now was the rhythm of leather saddles, dry grass brushing against boots, and the breath of the rider behind him, light but real. His hand rested on the colt at his hip, then shifted to the saddle horn instead, a small gesture laying a little of justice down from steel into the heart. Part 7. Standing with the girl. Cedar's afternoon air was thick with dust. Wagons jolted down the main street, iron rims screeching against the hardened ground, their sound tangled with horses' shrill neighs. The saloon had already lit its lamps, the smell of whiskey spilling into the street, mingling with sweat and leather, until the air itself felt heavy. When Jonah and Maria stepped out of the blacksmith's forge, the crowd stirred. A man emerged at the far end of the street, long black coat sweeping the dust hat brim shadowing half his face. He rode a broad-shouldered horse, its saddle trimmed with Mexican embroidery, a coiled whip hanging at his side. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. That's him. The one who bought the bride from Santa Fe. He's here to take back his property. The man's eyes cut straight into Maria, and she shivered. A crooked smile tugged one corner of his mouth. That girl, he barked, voice low and rasping, is mine. I paid gold, paid in full. No one cuts her chains without my word. The townsfolk shuffled aside, unwilling to invite trouble, yet eager to witness it. In Cedar, many lived by turning blind eyes. Justice was often haggled over whiskey. But that evening, something different flickered alive, Maria's gaze fixed on Jonah, silently demanding, whose side will you stand on? Jonah drew in a long breath, prairie wind burning deep into his chest. For years he had swallowed silence, letting the strong write the law with guns and fear. But now the iron at Maria's ankle rang like an echo of the shackles he had once failed to break. He could not step back. The air thickened. Jonah's hand moved slowly to his belt. Leather creaked. Horses snorted. The wind lashed grit against rooftops. Everything seemed to hold its breath. He drew the bone-handled knife scarred from a dozen winters. Steel caught a dim glint in the fading light. The man in black arched a brow, his hand hovering over his revolver. The crowd went silent. Jonah stepped before Maria. Without a glance at the buyer, he knelt. The blade slid across the chain. Metal scraped, metal sparks spat from the twist of his wrist. A sharp clang rang out as the shackle snapped and fell to the dirt. The sound carried down the entire street, bouncing off the warped wooden walls, thudding into every chest that heard it. It was more than iron breaking, it was a declaration. Maria straightened, eyes wet yet blazing, her breath shuddering as though she had just broken free from years of shadow. Jonah drove the knife into the earth, his hand trembling slightly, but his gaze unshaken, an unmoving marker in the wind. The buyer roared, "You just broke the law. You just stole from me." Jonah lifted his head. His voice was low, but it carried heavy enough for every ear in Cedar. A human being is never merchandise to be bought and sold. The words split the air. For a heartbeat, Cedar froze. Only the saloon door creaked open, faces peering out, eyes darting unsure. No one spoke. But inside each chest a small flame flickered, something long, smothered now sparked awake. The bride buyer's face flushed crimson as he yanked his revolver from its holster. At the same moment, a few saloon drifters and card sharps leaned aside, hands curling around their own gun grips, ready to side with the man who held the gold. The air tightened like a drawn bowstring. Dust swept through the street, carrying the faint chime of a wind bell hanging from the saloon porch. Jonah did not draw. He stood tall, arms loose at his sides, eyes fixed on the man. Maria pressed behind him, her hands trembling but no longer chained. That image alone, a man standing between her and the world, her shackles gone, struck the street silent. The buyer roared, "You'd die for her, rancher." A gunshot cracked, ripping the air apart. Horses tied outside the livery shrieked, hooves clattering in panic. A black cloud of crows burst from the saloon roof wings, slashing across the fading sky. When the smoke cleared, the bullet was buried in the dirt, not half a boot length from Jonah's toe. He had not fired straight. It was a threat, a show of power. Yet Jonah's stillness, his unflinching silence, made the man falter. Whispers spread through the crowd. An old woman's voice trembled. "My daughter was taken like that once." And no one spoke. A young man pushed forward. "The rancher's right. A person is no man's property." The murmur grew. People shifted. No one looked at Maria as a commodity anymore. Their eyes turned fear, giving way to outrage, indifference to fury. The buyer's jaw clenched, his face dark as bruised iron. He hissed through his teeth, "You forget who feeds this town, who pours your whiskey." But at that moment, the saloon keeper stepped outside, hands still black with coal dust, voice rasping low. "We've kept quiet long enough. Today, it ends." The words fell like a hammer. The street shifted. No one stood with the buyer anymore. The shadow of gold had been broken by one simple act cutting a chain. The man's growl curdled into silence. He looked around and found himself alone. No hand moved to back him. Only the wind stirred through cedar, rattling a warped signboard in the late sun. His revolver lowered, his face twisted with rage. Then he spurred his horse hard, storming away in a cloud of red dust. Maria stood trembling, her eyes wet, fixed on Jonah. The entire town watched. No jeers, no laughter, only a heavy silence, as though everyone understood Cedar would never be the same. Jonah bent, picked up the broken shackle from the dirt. His calloused hand shook as he gripped it. In the brittle wind, he spoke low, just enough for Maria to hear. "No one will ever bind you again." The words rang like a vow, though whispered. The street seemed to hold its breath. Only red dust, dry wind, and Maria's gaze finding its home in Jonah's eyes. The last of the daylight bled away, and darkness swallowed Cedar's wooden rooftops. Jonah knew the bride buyer would return with more men. He couldn't stand still any longer. He lifted Maria onto Maverick's back. The black stallion snorted, breath steaming as if it understood the danger ahead. Maria clutched the saddle, her torn wedding dress whipping in the wind. Jonah swung up behind her, yanked the reins hard. Hya! Maverick leapt forward, hooves pounding the hard earth, kicking up clouds of dust. The rhythm of hoofbeats echoed across the plain, blending with the howl of the wind. Cactus shadows and yucca stalks blurred past. Night birds burst from their nests, startled by the furious gallop. The Wild West stretched around them in its merciless vastness, moonlight glimmering on endless grass, red dust rising in waves, wind tearing across the prairie. Far behind, Cedar came alive with barking dogs and the shrill wail of whistles the chase had begun. Maria looked back, tears glistening, yet her eyes burned with the fire of survival. Jonah clenched the reins, jaw locked tight. "Hold on, girl. Tonight's gonna be a long one." The plains opened wide, the moon sliding behind ragged clouds. Maverick thundered into the darkness, breath streaming white. Suddenly a sandstorm twisted up ahead, a wall of dust swirling like a living thing. Jonah pulled at the reins but did not slow. A western storm was a nightmare for any rider, but behind them rode something worse. Sand lashed his face raw. Maria ducked low, her tattered gown whipping like broken sails. Jonah bent over her, shielding her with his body. Each pounding hoofbeat struck the earth like a drumbeat of war. Through the choking haze, memory surged. 10 years ago, he'd ridden like this before through a storm, clutching his wife and child as gunmen closed in. That night, he had been too late. His teeth bit hard into his lip, the taste of iron filling his mouth. Not this time. Not again. The storm thinned. Moonlight returned, revealing a trail curling toward the mountains. And there in the far distance glowed the red-orange sparks of pursuit. Riders were coming. Jonah whispered into the wind, voice hoarse but steady. "That night stole everything from me, but tonight, I'll let them take nothing more." Part 8. Flight into the night. The last of the daylight bled away, and darkness swallowed Cedar's wooden rooftops. Jonah knew the bride buyer would return with more men. He couldn't stand still any longer. He lifted Maria onto Maverick's back. The black stallion snorted, breath steaming, as if it understood the danger ahead. Maria clutched the saddle, her torn wedding dress whipping in the wind. Jonah swung up behind her, yanked the reins hard. Hi-ya! Maverick leapt forward, hooves pounding the hard earth, kicking up clouds of dust. The rhythm of hoofbeats echoed across the plain, blending with the howl of the wind. Cactus shadows and yucca stalks blurred past. Nightbirds burst from their nests, startled by the furious gallop. The Wild West stretched around them in its merciless vastness, moonlight glimmering on endless grass, red dust, rising in waves, wind tearing across the prairie. Far behind, Cedar came alive with barking dogs and the shrill wail of whistles the chase had begun. Maria looked back, tears glistening, yet her eyes burned with the fire of survival. Jonah clenched the reins, jaw locked tight. "Hold on, girl. Tonight's gonna be a long one. The plains opened wide, the moon sliding behind ragged clouds. Maverick thundered into the darkness, breath streaming white. Suddenly a sandstorm twisted up ahead, a wall of dust swirling like a living thing. Jonah pulled at the reins but did not slow. A western storm was a nightmare for any rider, but behind them rode something worse. Sand lashed his face raw. Maria ducked low, her tattered gown whipping like broken sails. Jonah bent over her, shielding her with his body. Each pounding hoofbeat struck the earth like a drumbeat of war. Through the choking haze, memory surged. 10 years ago, he'd ridden like this before, through a storm, clutching his wife and child as gunmen closed in. That night, he had been too late. His teeth bit hard into his lip, the taste of iron filling his mouth. Not this time. Not again. The storm thinned. Moonlight returned, revealing a trail curling toward the mountains. And there, in the far distance, glowed the red-orange sparks of pursuit. Riders were coming. Jonah whispered into the wind voice, hoarse but steady. That night stole everything from me, but tonight I'll let them take nothing more. The thunder of hooves closed in louder, nearer. The riders were upon them. A gunshot cracked the night, a bullet striking the dirt inches from Maverick's hooves, spraying dust. Maria jolted, clutching Jonah tight. Jonah's jaw tightened. He whipped his Colt free, turned in the saddle, and fired back. Muzzle flashes tore open the dark, echoing like lightning across the empty plains. Nearby, a herd of cattle stirred, then panicked. Lowing thunder rolled as the beasts stampeded, hooves pounding like war drums. Dust exploded into the air, a living wall of flesh and fury cutting across the pursuer's path. Jonah didn't hesitate. He spurred Maverick hard, steering into the chaos. Bullets cracked overhead, curses rang out, but most shots buried themselves in the hides of stampeding steers. In the confusion, Jonah and Maria slipped away like ghosts, vanishing into the dust. The trail led them down to a dry riverbed. Summer had left only a thin trickle of water, the rest mud and jagged stones. Maverick snorted, chest-heaving foam flecking his mouth. Behind them, the drum of hooves had not stopped. "We have to cross," Jonah muttered. He drove Maverick forward. Water splashed cold and sharp mud sucking at the stallion's legs. Maria nearly slipped, but Jonah caught her, one arm clamped around her waist. The last iron shackle on her wrist clinked together, ringing out like a funeral bell in the dead of night. At midstream, moonlight lit Maria's face. Her eyes, wet, trembling, shone with something more than fear. Trust. It struck Jonah's chest like an old wound torn open again. They dragged themselves onto the far bank. Maverick stumbled, knees buckling, his legs caked with mud. Jonah slid off, hauling the stallion forward by the reins, Maria clinging to the saddle. Behind them, torches flared, red serpents of fire winding across the plain. The hunters were still coming. On the hillside, Jonah stopped, the wind clawing at his coat. From this height, he could see the torches stretching out behind a line of fire snakes crawling toward them. Maria's voice shook as she whispered, If they catch me, leave me. Don't die for me." Jonah said nothing at first. Then he turned, laid a calloused hand on her shoulder. "No, I lost a family once in the dark. I won't let history repeat itself. From this night on, I stand with you." He raised his knife and with one clean stroke cut the last chain from her wrist. The shackle hit the ground with a hard metallic clang, ringing through the night like a hymn of freedom. Maria lifted her gaze, eyes shimmering, lips trembling, but voiceless. The riders' cries rose nearer, whips cracking, horses screaming. But in that moment, the world held only two souls, a lonely rancher and a chained bride breathing the same breath. Jonah turned toward the endless plain, moonlight sharpening the resolve in his eyes. Tonight, we'll rewrite fate. Part 9. The Small Flame. After a long night of flight, dawn broke. Mist blanketed the prairie and the wind carried a skin-cutting chill. Jonah reined in before his old cabin, its roof sagging doors, half-hanging fences long collapsed. For years he had only returned here like a ghost, never mending, letting memory and grief rot in silence. Maria slid down from Maverick. Her legs trembled, her torn wedding dress stained with red dust. Yet when her eyes met the cabin, there was something new within them. a flicker of curiosity, even safety. Compared to chains, even a broken house could be a refuge. Jonah lit a small fire in the stove. The crackle of wood filled the cabin, pushing back the cold. Maria froze at the sight. How long had it been since she'd seen fire used not for burning bonds, but for warmth? Outside, the west pressed on the wind, whipping through brittle trees, dust spiraling into tiny whirlwinds, distant hoofbeats carrying the reminder that danger was not far. But inside, the flame glowed like a fragile promise. Maria stepped to the hearth. Her wrists still bore the scars of iron, yet she knelt gently, arranging the wood, coaxing the fire higher. Jonah brought out dried beans and salted meat from his saddlebag. She washed them with what little water remained in the clay jar, then set the pot over the flame, each motion slow but deliberate. Firelight painted her face, drawn, weary, but softening. For the first time, Jonah did not see a victim shackled in chains, but a human being fighting to hold on to something ordinary. The smell of beans, salted pork, and wood smoke filled the air. To a rancher like Jonah, it was no feast. Yet in that moment, it felt like a miracle. Maria sat handing him an old tin bowl, her hands still trembling. When Jonah took it, her lips curved into the faintest smile, the first one. Small, fragile, but enough to chase a little of the darkness away. In the glow of the fire, the wind outside seemed to fade. What remained was only a simple meal, a long sigh of relief, and two lonely souls finding each other in a fleeting moment of peace. After the meal, Jonah quietly rewrapped the wounds on Maria's arms. The iron had bitten deep, leaving raw bleeding marks. With a strip of worn cloth, his calloused hands moved carefully. Maria flinched, her eyes darting with the wary fear of someone who had long known only the whip. Jonah froze for a moment. The image came rushing back, his wife years ago, with that same look just before she was bound and stolen away. His chest tightened. But when Maria looked back at him now, there was more than fear in her eyes. A fragile spark of trust glimmered there. He gave a small nod and continued bandaging. Silence filled the room, broken only by the wind sweeping outside and the crackle of burning wood. In that silence, it was as if both were relearning how to believe in another human being. Night fell. Wolves howled from the distant hills, yet inside the cabin the fire burned steadily. Maria sat near the hearth, her tangled hair glowing with the flames, her eyes catching the light. Then softly, so faint it seemed she was afraid of her own voice, she whispered, "Thank you." One small word, but to Jonah it carried the weight of a whole world. For years he had lived in silence, never believing he would hear such honest gratitude again. His chest ached, his eyes stung. Maria began to sing, a trembling clear note of an old Spanish folk song. Her voice wove into the wind, into the rhythm of the fire, stitching something torn within both their hearts. Jonah leaned back in his wooden chair. For the first time in years, his eyes closed not from whiskey, but from a rare, quiet peace. By morning, the sun spread gold across the prairie. Maria was sweeping the porch hair undone and dancing in the light. Her eyes carried a faint brightness, and she no longer looked like a woman chained in iron, but someone slowly returning from ashes. Jonah stood at the fence, hand brushing Maverick's mane, watching her. A strange feeling stirred in him, as if this broken house, once a graveyard of memory, was beginning to breathe again. Maria turned, her lips curving into a light smile, small, fleeting, but enough to send brightness spilling through the cabin walls. And Jonah realized sometimes one small flame is enough to push back an endless darkness. If it were you, after carrying wounds like Maria's, would you believe a single small flame could be the start of a new life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Part 10. A New Home. Morning light spilled across the prairie like golden honey. Dew clung to the grass, shimmering with each breath of wind that carried the damp scent of earth after a long night. In the distance, cattle bellowed their calls, blending with the sharp cry of migrating birds slicing through the clear sky. Jonah stood on the porch of the old wooden house, his calloused hand resting on the weathered fence. He had long grown used to the silence of dawn, but today, everything felt different. The house was no longer empty. Inside, Maria's quiet footsteps moved as she folded blankets. He turned and their eyes met in the doorway. Her hair was tousled, her face still weary, but beneath the morning sun she wore a faint smile. Jonah drew in a deep breath, his voice low and rough. "You're free now." The words were not only for Maria. They were whispered to himself too, after years of being bound in the shadows of memory. Maria sat down on the wooden steps. The torn wedding dress had been trimmed and stitched by Jonah into something simple, modest. Her hands rested on her knees as she looked out over the wide-open prairie. For so long she had known only chains, shackles, and the filthy eyes of the man who bought her. Now before her stretched a horizon without walls. Jonah brought out a tin cup of thick black coffee steam curling upward. He set it before her and said quietly, "Out west, this is how a day begins." Maria lifted it, her hands trembling. The heat pressed against her skin. She took a small sip, bitter yet warm. The taste sank deep into her chest, steadying her heartbeat. She looked at Jonah, lips parting as if to speak. But instead she only nodded, letting the gesture carry her gratitude. In the silence between them, it felt as though wounds were slowly knitting closed. Outside, the sun climbed higher, pulling the night's shadows away. At noon, sunlight poured gold across the grasslands. Jonah pulled from the barn an old harmonica, its metal dulled with years of dust. He lifted it to his lips and blew a few hesitant notes. At first, the sound was rough and broken, but soon it stretched into a melody carried by the wind, low, wandering like the story of the West itself, sorrowful, wild, yet threaded with hope. Maria sat beneath the shade of a tree listening. Her eyes widened as if for the first time she glimpsed another soul hidden within the hardened, silent man. Each note drew a contrast in her mind between the clank of chains she once wore and this fragile song of freedom. Her heart beat faster with every rise of the tune. When Jonah lowered the harmonica, Maria spoke softly, her voice trembling yet clear. "Music, it feels like being unchained." Jonah looked at her, and for the first time in years, a smile tugged at his lips, an honest smile, warm and unforced. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled heavy across the horizon. The wind rose, sweeping red dust into the air. A sudden storm crashed over the prairie, tearing at dry grass and rattling the cabin doors. Jonah rushed out to secure the horse pen while Maria clung to the doorframe. The wind howled like gunfire, and the horses screamed in fear. In the chaos, Jonah ran back and pulled Maria against him, shielding her. They huddled by the fire while the cabin shuddered under the storm's fury. Maria pressed her ear against Jonah's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm stronger than the raging winds, a silent vow of safety. Outside was chaos, but within fire still burned and a shelter still stood. Maria whispered, "Maybe this is where I belong." Jonah said nothing, but his arms tightened around her. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the sky washed clean and startlingly clear. Dew glistened across the prairie like scattered glass. Jonah stepped onto the porch and saw Maria gathering firewood, her cheeks flushed pink in the morning sun. His voice was low, steady. "You're free now, but if you wish, you can stay. We'll rebuild this place into a true home." Maria paused, lifting her gaze to his. For the first time, her eyes held not only fear or gratitude, but a spark of hope. A real smile spread across her face. On the wide frontier of 1880, where justice was often buried in silence, a small flame had been lit. No one knew what the future might bring, but in that moment, Jonah and Maria had the beginnings of a new home. Dawn of a second chance. Morning light spilled across the weathered cabin roof, laying a soft golden veil over the prairie. Maverick grazed lazily by the fence, his breath rising in pale clouds through the mist. The air was quiet, broken only by the faint whisper of wind through the dry boards, like a song unfinished, now continued. Jonah stood on the porch, one calloused hand resting against the post. Maria stepped out beside him. No vows spoken, no contracts written. Only her presence an answer to the years he thought he would live in solitude. Their eyes met, not to flee the past, but to accept it. Even in the harshest West, there could still be such a thing as a second chance. Jonah exhaled, not in weariness, but in release. In his heart, a truth stirred. Justice does not always come from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it begins with the hand that dares to break another's chains. Maria smiled, fragile yet bright like a shaft of sunlight piercing straight into Jonah's chest. He understood then, this house was no longer a shelter for a broken soul, but a flame newly lit. The dawn rose higher, carrying with it a new beginning. And there, two people once bound by pain now found freedom in each other. Justice is not only born of bullets. Sometimes it begins with a single hand unfastening the chains. No one is ever too late for a second chance. Do you believe one small act can change the course of a life? If you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.